Miss Deborah, hello. How are you? It's weird seeing me on Wednesday, isn't it? Hello, everyone. Good evening, good Wednesday evening. Thank you so much for joining me today. For anyone who has stumbled upon this live, hello, you have stumbled upon a book reading. And we are actually in the final book of this quartet. So if you are new here, because normally I read on Mondays. This is kind of a makeup day, so I normally read every Monday from 8 to 9 or 8 to 9:15. So if you are new, welcome, hello, it's nice to meet you. And if you are one of my followers, thank you so much for joining me on a Wednesday, which is not our normal routine. But if you'd like to see any of the previous readings of this book series, as well as the other books that I have read so far, you can actually go to my YouTube channel, which you can find the link in my bio here. And it will direct you to my reading playlist, and it will also direct you to my main content that I create here on TikTok. So if you are interested in any of that, please feel free to subscribe on YouTube. And if not, you know, welcome. You are free to join us on Mondays when we normally read. So good, Miss Deborah, good. It's good to see you too. Have you taken a nap today? Do you think you'll make it through the whole reading today? So if you're new, typically what we do is we wait till about 5 after for people to get logged on, to get in their comfy clothes, to get their favorite drink, to get comfy. And then, you know, you just let me read. You just let me read to you for like an hour. And we all get to veg and be zen in this otherwise crazy world that we live in right now. So, hello everyone. But you're sitting up, not laying down. That's the key. The key is to stay upright, to resist the temptation to fall asleep. That's the key. Oh my gosh. All right, real quick, just like thumbs up or some kind of notification, like let me know if the volume of the live is okay. I think it is, but just give me some indication that you guys can hear me well. Or not. Sounds good. Excellent. Very good. I wonder if Ishmael's going to be joining us tonight. Hello all. I'm so excited to see you guys here this evening. Thank you for joining us. For anyone who does not know, we are reading from this series here, and we are actually in the home stretch of this story. Tonight we start with the final book of the final book of this series. So again, if you missed anything, even if you've missed the entire thing up until today, please feel free to go catch up on my YouTube channel and feel free to enjoy some of the other stories that I have read so far. So I'd say we've got another, I don't know, maybe another 3 readings. Maybe another 3 readings, and we'll be done with this book, and then we'll move on to something new. So if there actually is a story or an author that you want me to check out for our next reading, please feel free to hit me up with a message and let me know if you've got like a particular author that you want me to explore or a particular story that you might want me to read. I'm always down to find new things to read, new genres to explore. So you guys just let me know. I mean, if you don't, that's fine. I've got like a whole library at my house ready to go for more books that I haven't read in a while. So we've got options. Don't worry, we've got options. So we've got another maybe 2 minutes before we get started. So go ahead and get in your comfy listening spot, or go ahead and get dinner ready, or whatever you're doing for the evening. Or afternoon, I guess, depending on if you're listening from some other part of the world right now. Or morning? No. But anyway. Yes, some names that I don't know. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm so excited to see you guys. Yeah, I'm curious to see how many new people we get because, like I said, I normally don't read on Wednesdays. I normally am reading on Mondays. So today's a makeup day. I did not sleep well on Sunday, and by the time I got home from work on Monday, I was like, I'm not going to be able to make it. I'm not going to be able to stay awake to read. So I apologize if this puts a kink in anyone's listening experience, but it won't be a repeat thing, I promise. So, all right. Go ahead and put that on silent. So, of this series, like of this book, the fourth book of this quartet is called Son, S-O-N, as, you know, the title of the live is called. But book 3 of this fourth book, it's called Beyond. So if you actually happen to have this book and you're following along, we are on the very first chapter of the third book of Son. And here we go. The old woman appeared frequently. Suddenly she would be there, standing in the thick pines beside the river, watching him as he worked. Gabe would catch sight of her, would see her dark homespun clothing, her stooped posture, and the fierce, knowing intimacy of her gaze. Then she would withdraw and disappear into the shaded grove of trees. If he turned away and then looked back, there was no longer a sign of her, not even a whispering motion in the needled branches she had moved through. She simply went away. Sometimes he thought of calling after her, asking who she was, why she watched him. But for some reason, he felt shy. He saw her in the village as well, but noticed her less there because he was generally in the company of friends. He and the other boys, the group he lived with, would be wrestling and joking, vying to be the cleverest or strongest, as they made their way together to or from the schoolhouse. Sometimes the people of the village complained about them and their horseplay, said that they were a noisy, inconsiderate group, worse than any bunch of adolescents that had ever lived in Boys' Lodge. One neighbor had called them louts after they wrested plums from the tree beside her cottage, then squashed them in the path. This particular old woman, though she was often nearby, never glared at the group of boys as others did, or chided them for their behavior. She simply watched. She had been doing it for a long time, and Gabe thought that she watched him most of all. It puzzled him. Occasionally, he thought about using his power. Well, he never knew exactly what to call it, but he thought of it as veering, to try to learn more about who she was, why she watched him. But he never did. His power made him nervous. He found veering tiring, painful, and a little frightening. So though he tested it now and then, seeing if it was still there, and it always was, sometimes he found himself wishing it wouldn't be, trying to understand it, and he never did. Not really. He rarely called it into full use. Anyway, she was gone. He was annoyed at himself for the time he had wasted, wondering about her, when he had so much to do still. Sighing, Gabe looked around the clearing on the riverbank, the place he had claimed for his task, the place where he was now spending hours every day. His bare feet were deep in wood shavings. He smiled at himself, realizing there was sawdust on his face, stuck there by his own sweat. He licked his lips and tasted powdered cedar. The boards that he had crafted so carefully were neatly stacked, but his tools were scattered about, and it looked from the graying clouds as if rain was on the way. He heard a rumble of thunder. Time to get things into the shed. But even as he moved his tools, trudging back and forth to store them in the primitive little structure he had built between two trees, he found himself thinking again of the old woman. There were so few mysteries in the village. When new residents arrived, there was always a ceremony of welcome. Their histories were told. He remembered none for her, but he would have been a child then. He had seen the strange woman for years now, had felt her eyes on him since he was a young boy, and he rarely attended the ceremonies. Some of the histories were interesting, Gabe thought, especially if they involved danger and narrow escapes, but people rambled on, and sometimes they wept, which embarrassed him. I'll stop being shy, he thought. Next time I notice her staring at me the way she does, I'll simply introduce myself. Then she'll have to tell me who she is. The rain began spattering suddenly. Gabe closed the crooked, hastily made door of the shed he had built from old boards. Briefly he glanced back through the increasing downpour at the grove of trees where the woman stood from time to time. Then he closed the latch on the door of the shed and ran through the rain toward the village. "How's the boat coming?" It was Simon, one of his friends, standing on the porch of Boy's Lodge, as Gabe climbed the steps and shook his head to try to get some of the wetness out of his curly hair. "All right, I guess. Slow." He went inside to change into dry clothes. It would be time for dinner soon, he thought. There were no clocks in the village, but the bell tower rang at intervals, and the mid-afternoon bell had sounded a long time ago. On a shelf in his cubicle, Gabe found a clean, folded shirt and put it on. He tossed his wet one into a bin in the hall. He lived in Boy's Lodge with 12 other adolescent orphaned boys. Most of his lodge mates had lost their parents to illness or accident, though one, Tariq, had been abandoned as an infant by an irresponsible couple who had no interest in raising a child. All of the boys had a history to tell. Gabe did too, but he didn't enjoy the telling. There were too many I don't knows to it. He had asked Jonas again and again. It was Jonas who had brought him here years before, when Gabe was just an infant. "Why did my parents let you take me?" he had asked. "You didn't have parents," Jonas had explained. "Everybody has parents." "Not in the place where we lived. Things were different there." "How about you? Did you have parents?" "I had people I called mother and father. I'd been assigned to them." "Well, what about me?" "You hadn't been assigned yet. You were a bit of a problem." Gabe had grinned at that. He liked the idea of being troublesome. It seemed to give him a certain superiority. "I have to have parents, though. People don't just get born from nothing." "You know what, Gabe? I was just a boy then. Babies appeared from the infant care building and were given to parents. I accepted it. I never knew anything else. I never asked where babies had come from." Gabe had hooted with laughter. "Ha! Where do babies come from? Every kid asks that." Gabe was laughing, but Jonas had looked serious and concerned. "You're right," he said slowly, "and I do remember that there were young girls chosen each year to be what was called birth mothers. They must have been the ones who— What happened to the birth mothers? What happened to my birth mother?" "I don't know, Gabe." "She didn't want me?" Jonas sighed. "I don't know, Gabe. It was a different system. I'm going to find out." "How?" Gabe was very young then, no more than 9, but he swaggered when he replied, "I'll go back there. You can't stop me. I'll find a way." Now that the boys had moved out of the childhood place where they had spent their first few years, now that they were in Boys' Lodge, their interests had changed and they rarely talked of their earlier years. It was girls who did that, Gabe thought. At Girls' Lodge, he heard, the girls talked long into the evening, retelling their own tales to each other. For the boys, though, talk was now of school, or of sports, or the future, not the past. Boys' Lodge was a congenial group. They did their schoolwork together in the evenings and shared meals, their food prepared by a staff of 2 workers in the kitchen. There was a lodge director, a kindly man who had a room within the building, and who mediated the infrequent disputes among the boys. One could go to him with problems, but Gabe often wished that he lived in a house with a family, the way his best friend Nathaniel did. Nathaniel had parents and 2 sisters. Their house was noisy with bickering and laughter. Glancing through the window, through the rain that had now almost stopped, He could see the house where Nathaniel lived, farther along the curved path. Its little garden was thick with summer flowers, and as he watched, a door opened and a gray cat was sent outside, where it assumed a pose, in the way of cats, on the little porch and licked its paws. It was Deirdre's cat. Gabe tried to remember its name. He could picture Nathaniel's sister laughing when she had told it to him, but the whimsical name eluded him. Catacomb? Cataclysm? No, but it was something like those. Deirdre was good with words. Pretty, too. Gabe flushed briefly, a little embarrassed at his own thoughts. He watched the cat, hoping that Deirdre would appear at the door. Maybe she would sit down and stroke the gray fur. Catapult! That was its name. He pictured her there, stroking Catapult, gazing into the distance, maybe thinking about him? Maybe? Could that be possible? Of course, he realized suddenly, he could veer and find out. But maybe he didn't really want to know. And anyway, there wasn't time. The dinner bell was about to ring. The other boys, laughing and noisy, would soon be rushing down the hallway. Also, Gabe reminded himself, shaking off the thoughts about Nathaniel's pretty, dark-haired sister, it wasn't fair to her, even if he found that she did care about him. She shouldn't. Very soon he would finish his boat, and then he would be gone. Pause for a water break. And once again, I missed my mouth. God. Chapter 2. You know he's building a boat. Kira nodded. She had just gotten the children to sleep. They were so lively, into everything. Now that Annabelle could walk, she followed her 2-year-old brother Matthew into all kinds of mischief. Kira was exhausted by evening. She brought her cup of tea, set her walking stick aside, and sat down beside Jonas, who looked troubled. I know. I was here when he came for the books, remember? Jonas glanced at the walls of the room. Shelves of books extended from the floor to the ceiling, and not just this room, but all the others in the house he shared with his family. It was one of the things they were trying now to teach the children, not to pull and grab at the books. So tempting for babies. The bright colors. He remembered when the dog, as a puppy, had indulged in the same mischief, and again they had found corners of the lower volumes chewed. Now Frolic was middle-aged, overweight, lazy, and no longer needed to chew. He slept, snoring, on his folded blanket most of the day, and it was the toddlers who grabbed and gnawed. I always knew this time would come, Jonas said. He told me when he was much younger that he would go looking for his past. Kira nodded again. Of course he wonders, she pointed out. It will be the next generation, the ones like our children who were born here, who don't feel that pull. Both of them, like almost everyone in the small village, had come from another place, had fled something, had escaped from hardship of some kind. Jonas stood. He stared through the window out into the night. Kira recognized the look. Her husband had always had that need, to turn his gaze outward, to try and find the answers to things. It was the first thing she had noticed about him, the piercing blue eyes, and the way he had of seeming to see beyond what was obvious. In their early days together, when Jonas was leader, he had called on that vision often for answers to problems. But the problems had fallen away. The village had thrived, and Jonas had relinquished leadership to others, so that he could take up an unburdened life with his family. Now he was the protector of the books and the knowledge. He was the scholar and librarian. It was Jonas to whom Gabriel had come not long ago, looking for books with diagrams and instructions, so that he could learn to build a boat. He sighed, turning away from the darkness that was enfolding the village. I worry about him, he said. Kira set aside the needlework she had picked up. She went to him, circled her arms around his waist, and looked up into those solemn eyes that were as blue as her own. Of course you do. You brought him here. It had been years before that Jonas, hardly more than a boy himself then, had brought Gabriel, a toddler with no past, a child who deserved a future, to this village, which had welcomed them with no questions. He was so little, and he had no one. He had you. I was a boy. I couldn't be a parent to him. I didn't know what that meant. The people who raised me did their best, but it was just a job to them. Jonas sighed, recalling the couple he had called mother and father. I remember that once I asked them if they loved me, he said. And? He shook his head. They didn't know what that meant. They said the word was meaningless. They did their best, Kira said after a moment, and he nodded. Gabe's older now than I was when I brought him here, Jonas mused. Stronger, braver. Not as handsome, though. She reached up, smiling, and smoothed a strand of his hair. Ordinarily, he would have grinned back at her, but his face was worried and his thoughts were elsewhere. And I'm pretty sure he has a gift of some sort. Kira sighed. She knew what that meant. She and Jonas both had a gift. Sometimes it was exhilarating, but it was demanding too, and burdensome, to know how to use it well and when. I worry about what he'll find if he goes searching, Jonas went on. He wants a family, and there won't be one. He was frowning, he searched for the right description. He was a manufactured product, he said at last. We all were. Kira sat silently. It was a chilling description. Finally, thoughtfully, she replied, All of us came here from difficult places, she reminded him. But you had a mother who loved you. I did, until she died. Then I was all alone. But you had her at least for how many years? Almost 15. That's close to Gabe's age now. He feels such a longing for something, and I worry that he'll never find it, that it never was there, but... Jonas rose and went to the window. Kira watched him as he stood there, looking out into the darkness. Beyond him, she could see the outline of trees moving slightly in a night breeze against the dark, starless sky. But what? She asked, when he had stood silently for a long moment. I'm not sure. I can feel something out there. Something connected to Gabe. Something dangerous? She asked in an apprehensive tone. We must warn him if there's something dangerous out there. No. Jonas shook his head. He was still focusing on something beyond the room. No, he's not in danger. At least not now. But there is a presence. It seems benign. I think... He paused. I think something... Someone is looking for him. Or waiting for him, watching him. He didn't tell Kira what else he felt, because he didn't comprehend it himself, and because he didn't want to alarm her. But there was something else out there, something vaguely at the edges of his awareness, something not really connected to Gabe. And the something else was vaguely familiar, and very dangerous. Chapter 3. At first, his friends had helped him, but that time had passed. Now they were off fishing, playing ball, indulging in all the usual summer pastimes during this brief holiday from school. The excitement of Gabe's project was short-lived, and their interest waned when they realized he was not just hammering together a primitive raft that they could paddle along the riverbank. Gabe hummed to himself as he measured his boards. He had a vague picture in his mind of the way they should go together. But though the books he had borrowed from Jonas had shown boats of all kinds, from ones with billowy sails to long, narrow vessels with rows of seated men at oars, none had provided instructions for the building. His would be small, he knew, just big enough for him and his supplies. It would have a paddle. He had already begun carving one, crouched in his little shed during rainy days. Any chance you'd like to go fishing? Gabe looked up at the sound of the voice. Nathaniel, tall and brown from the sun, was standing on the path holding his gear. Often they had fished together, usually from a huge rock on the bank farther along. The river was easy to fish, slow-moving and somewhat shallow there. The silvery, sinuous trout were eager for the bait, and made good eating later. It was tempting, but Gabe shook his head. "Can't. I'm behind. This is slower going than I thought it would be." "What's that?" Nathaniel asked, pointing to the edge of the clearing where a leafy stack of thin poles waited. Gabe looked over. "Bamboo." "You can't build from that. You need real planks for a boat." Gabe laughed. "I know. I'm using cedar, but I need the bamboo for... Well, here, I'll show you." He wiped his sweaty hands on the hem of his shirt and then went and got the large book from the shed. "Jonas let you bring it here?" Nathaniel asked in surprise. Gabe nodded. "I had to promise to keep it clean and dry." He set the book on a flat rock, squatted there, and turned the pages. "Look," he said, pointing to a page. Nathaniel looked at the picture of a large vessel with its many sails unfurled. The rigging was complicated, with countless lines and winches holding the billowing sails in place, and a large crew of men could be seen on deck. "You're crazy," Nathaniel said. "You can't build that." Gabe chuckled. No, I just wanted to show you. It's not for rivers anyway. They sailed them once on oceans. I think we learned about it in history class." Nathaniel nodded. "There were pirates," he recalled. "That's the part I paid attention to." Gabe turned the pages slowly. He smiled. "Here's mine," he said, and he rifled the pages until the book opened to a page near the end, a place that had clearly been opened to frequently. "Don't laugh." But Nathaniel did. When he leaned down to look at the picture, Gabe, watching his face, chuckled as well. The picture was of a tiny boat, with one lone man, huge waves surging around him, shark fins visible in the foam. There was endless sea and sky. The man looked terrified and doomed. "So you're planning your own death? Where is this guy anyway?" "Ocean. But that's far from here. I don't need to think about ocean, just river. And I'm not going to end up like him. I'm just copying his boat. Sort of. Mine's smaller and doesn't have that cabin part. Mine will be little and sturdy. That's all I need. It'll be easy to build." Gabe looked around at the piles of boards, the sawdust, the mess on the ground. "Well, I thought it would be easy." "How will you steer it?" Nathaniel asked, still peering at the picture of the lone man cowering in the boat as the waves approached. "Paddle. Anyway, the river will carry it. I don't need to steer much, just to go ashore when I want to." "So what's the bamboo for?" "It'll hold it together. I invented this system myself. Once I get the cedar all arranged in the right shape, I'll use the bamboo. First I'll wet it, so that when it dries it tightens. It'll be like rope." Nathaniel looked around. The cedar planks were lying haphazardly about, a few of them hammered together. He could see that Gabe had been preparing the bamboo, peeling and slicing it thin. It was a huge task for a boy to do alone. "Does anybody ever come and help you?" Gabriel hesitated. "Not really. Some old woman comes and watches me, though." He gestured toward the grove of pines. "She stands over there." "An old woman?" "Yes, you've seen her. She's all bent over, and you can tell she has trouble walking. She sort of follows me. I don't know why. Someday I'm going to yell at her to stop." Nathaniel looked uneasy. He gave a nervous laugh. "You can't yell at an old woman," he said. "I know. I was kidding. Maybe I'll just growl and scare her a little." Gabe made a face and growled loudly, imitating a beast of some kind. The boys both laughed. "Sure you don't want to go fishing?" Nathaniel asked. Gabe shook his head and picked up the book to return it to the shed. "Can't." His friend gathered his things and turned away. "Deirdre says she misses you," he remarked with a sly grin. "You're never around lately." Gabe sighed. He looked up the path as if he might see Nathaniel's pretty sister there. "Will she come to the feast tomorrow night?" Nathaniel nodded and shouldered his fishing pole. Everyone will. My mother's at the gathering place now, helping to get things ready. Tell Deidre I'll see her there. Gabe gave his friend a wave and turned again to his work as the other boy walked away. I don't know, guys. We're burning through these chapters pretty quick. Maybe we'll get this done in 2 readings. Who knows? Chapter 4. Feasts were frequent in the village. Sometimes there was an excuse. Harvest, midsummer, or a marriage. But often, no reason was necessary. People just wanted a time of merriment, laughter, dressing up, eating, and overeating, and so a feast was planned. Kira dressed the children in bright-colored embroidered outfits that she had designed and stitched. She was a masterful seamstress. Many people sought her out to create their wedding clothes, and they still talked in the village about the hand-woven cloth adorned with intricately patterned birds of all kinds, in which she had wrapped the body of her father before his burial. Kira's father had been blind, and sound had been his life. He knew. He could imitate each bird's call and song. They came from the trees, unafraid to eat from his outstretched hands. The entire village had gathered to sing a farewell as he was laid to rest, but the only song that day was theirs. The birds had fallen silent, as if they mourned. Her own garment for the feast was a deep blue dress, the entwined blue ribbons through the straps of her sandals and in her long hair. Jonas smiled at her in admiration and affection, but his own clothing, even on feast night, was simple. A homespun shirt over coarse trousers. With a roll of his eyes, he let his wife attach a blue flower from the garden to his collar. Jonas was not fond of decoration. His tastes were plain. Annabelle and Matthew scampered about the large room, giggling, while Kira wrapped the pie she had baked and placed it in a basket she had adorned with daisies and ferns. Frolic yawned and rose from the blanket where he'd been napping. The dog sensed excitement and wanted to take part. Noticing, Kira laughed and leaned over to wind a stemmed flower around his neck. "There," she said, "now you're in our party outfit too." Tail wagging, Frolic followed the family as they set out from their house. Jonas carried the pie basket, and Matthew rode atop his father's shoulders. Annabelle held tightly to her mother's free hand, the hand that didn't grasp the cane that Kira had always needed for walking. Ahead, beyond the curve of the path, they could already hear music, flutes and fiddles, from the gathering place where celebrations were held. It was a very small village that had had its beginnings years before in a gathering of outcasts, fleeing battles or chaos of all kinds, often wounded or driven out by their own clans or villages. Each of the original settlers had made his way to this place. They had found strength in one another, and had formed a community. They had welcomed others. From time to time, as the years had passed, people muttered that they shouldn't let newcomers in. The village was becoming overcrowded, and it was hard sometimes for the newcomers to learn the customs and rules. There were arguments and petitions and debates. "What if my daughter wants to marry one of them?" They talk with a funny accent. "What if there aren't enough jobs? Why should we have to support them while they're learning our ways?" It had been Jonas, during his time as leader, who had gently but firmly reminded the villagers that they had all been outsiders once. They had all come here for a new life. Eventually, they had voted to remain what they had become, a sanctuary, a place of welcome. As a child, Gabe had yawned and fidgeted when his class was taken, as each school class was, to visit the village museum and learn the history. History was boring, he thought. He was embarrassed when the museum curator, pointing to various artifacts in Vehicles of Arrival exhibit, had gestured to the battered red sled and explained that a brave boy named Jonas had battled a blizzard and fought his way here carrying a dying baby. And today we all know that Jonas has become our village leader, and the baby he rescued and brought here is a healthy boy, the curator had said dramatically, named Gabriel. His classmates grinned at him. They poked each other and giggled. Gabe pretended to be bored. He averted his eyes and leaned down to scratch an imaginary bug bite on his leg. Most of the earliest settlers, those with their stories recorded in the museum, had grown old and were gone now. Kira's father, Christopher, was buried in the village cemetery beside the pine grove. Left for dead by his enemies in a distant community, he had stumbled, sightless, to this village and been saved. With his new name of Seer, he had lived a long life here of dignity and wisdom. Kira tended his grave now, taking the babies with her while she weeded and watered the soft blanket of fragrant purple thyme she had planted there. He was buried beside his adopted son, Matty. The villagers remembered Matty as a fun-loving young man who had been destroyed when he fought the evil, unknowable forces that had menaced the village in those harsher times 7 years earlier. Thinking of those times as he passed the cemetery on his way to the evening's festivities, Gabe recalled the day Matty's body had been found and carried home. Gabe had been young then, only 8, a rambunctious resident of the children's house, happiest with solitary adventures and disinterested in schoolwork. But he had always admired Matty, who had tended and helped Seer with such devotion and undertaken village tasks with energy and good humor. It had been Matty who had taught Gabe to bait a hook and cast his line from the fishing rock. Matty who had shown him how to make a kite and catch the wind with it. The day of his death, Gabe had huddled, heartbroken, in the shadow of a thick stand of trees, and watched as the villagers lined the path and bowed their heads in respect to watch the litter carrying the ravaged body move slowly through. Frightened by his own feelings, he had listened mutely to the wails of grief that permeated the community. That day had changed him. It had changed the entire village. Shaken by the death of a boy they had loved, each person had found ways to be more worthy of the sacrifice he had made. They had become kinder, more careful, more attentive to one another. They had worked hard to eradicate customs that had begun to corrupt their society, banning even seemingly benign diversions, such as a gaming machine, a simple gambling device that spit out candy to its owners. For years, a mysterious, sinister man known as Trademaster had appeared now and then in the village, bringing tawdry thrills and temptation, but leaving chaos and discontentment behind. It had been Jonas, as leader, who saw through him, who sensed the deep evil in the man and insisted on his banishment. Freed of the menacing greed and self-indulgence that had almost overwhelmed them during that time, the villagers had learned to celebrate themselves, as they were doing this evening. Gabe stood still in the path for a moment. He noticed a small bouquet of fresh flowers beside the stone into which Matty's name had been carved. The village people honored Matty's memory with such tokens because he had made them into better people. Gabe did so more privately. He did so by reminding himself of a conversation he had once with the older boy who he had so admired. "You must pay more attention in school, Gabe," Matty had told him. Gabe had been required to stay late after classes that day for extra help. Now they were sitting together on the outcropping of rock at the edge of the river. "I don't like school," Gabe had replied, feeling the fishing line between his fingers. "I didn't either, and I was willful and full of mischief, same as you, but Seer made me work at it because he cared about me so much." Gabe shrugged. "Nobody cares about me." "Leader does. I do." "I guess," Gabe acknowledged. "He's the one who brought you here. He had a hard time of it, too." Gabe rolled his eyes. "Did you hear that at the museum as part of the tour? I wish they'd stop telling that stupid story and give me another worm, would you? Mine wiggled off the hook." Patiently, Matty helped him to rebait his hook. "You need knowledge," he said. "That's how Jonas got to be leader, by studying." "I don't want to be leader." "Neither do I, but I want to know stuff. Don't you?" Gabe sighed. "Some stuff, maybe. Not math. Not grammar." Matty had laughed. Then he had turned serious again for a moment. "And Gabe?" "What?" "You're going to find that you have a gift of some kind. Some of us do, and you're going to be one. I can tell. Gabe busied himself with the worm and the hook. For some reason, the conversation had begun to make him self-conscious. I know, Maddie said, it's hard to talk about because it's hard to understand. But it's another reason why you must study. You must make yourself ready. Someday you'll be called upon for something special, maybe something dangerous. So you have to prepare yourself, Gabe. You'll need knowledge. Look, Gabe said loudly, changing the subject, and pointed. There's a big trout over there where the rock makes a shallow. He's hiding, but he sees us. Look at his eyes. Maddie sighed affectionately and turned his attention to the large fish suspended in the dark water by the rock. It withdrew further, as if it felt their sudden interest, and its shiny eyes darted back and forth. Maddie watched. He thinks he can escape us by lurking there in the dark. But not us, Gabe. We're too clever for him. Let's do it. Let's try to get him. Thinking of it now, Gabe remembered it all. The laughter, the puzzling conversation, the sunshine that day, the sound of the slow-moving river, and then their stealthy maneuvers as they stalked the huge, silvery fish, finally caught him, and then threw him back. It had all been years ago, and they had never had another chance to talk in that way. Maddie had been correct, though, about needing to learn stuff. Gabe had tried hard to settle into his studies, and it served him well now. The math he had hated, as he measured and fitted together the pieces of his boat. But he found himself wishing now that he had not felt so awkward, that he had confided in Maddie that day. He had just discovered it then, the power that he had, the power to veer, and was still confused by it. It had been at a feast, one of the usual celebrations. Probably midsummer, he thought now, remembering it. With the older boys his age, 8 and 9, he had joined the crowd watching a contest. 2 of the village men were wrestling. Their bodies were smeared with oil so that their hands slid as they tried to grasp at each other. The crowd shouted encouragement, and the men repositioned themselves, shifting on their feet, each waiting for the right instant, the right move, to topple the other and emerge as the winner. Gabe, watching intently, found his own bare feet shifting in the dirt. He panted, imitating the wrestlers. He focused on his own favorite, the man called Miller, who was in charge of grain production each fall. Miller was a large man and a likable one who sometimes on slow work days organized the boys into teams and taught them intricate games on the playing field. Even in the midst of this intense match, Miller was laughing as he caught his opponent in a hold and struggled to hold him down. Gabe, moving his own skinny body in imitation of the wrestlers, found himself wondering how it felt to be Miller, to be so strong, so in command of his muscles and limbs. Suddenly, an odd silence enveloped him. He stopped hearing the grunts of the wrestlers, the shouts of the crowd, the barking of dogs, the music from the fiddlers playing nearby, and he felt himself move in the silence. He veered, though the word had not come to him yet. And then he entered Miller, became Miller, experienced Miller, was Miller for that instant. He knew briefly how it felt to be strong, to be in command, to be winning, to be loving the battle and the coming win. Then sound returned. Gabe returned. The crowd roared in approval, and Miller stood with his arms raised, victorious, then leaned forward and helped his laughing opponent up. Gabe slid to the ground and huddled there in the cheering crowd, breathing hard, exhausted, confused, and exhilarated. After that day, it happened again, several times, until he could feel it coming, and then, later, found that he could command and control the veer. Once, he remembered guiltily, he tried to use it to cheat in school. Seated at his desk, floundering over a math test, fractions, which he had not studied the way he should have, he glanced up at Mentor, the schoolmaster. Mentor was standing near the window, looking at the board on which the test questions had been written. If I could veer into Mentor right now, enter Mentor, Gabe thought, I could grab all of the answers to these test problems. He concentrated. He closed his eyes and thought about Mentor, about his knowledge, about what it would be like to be Mentor. Sure enough, the silence came. He felt his consciousness shift and move toward the schoolmaster. Within seconds he was there, within the man, experiencing being mentor. The veer worked, but not in the way Gabe had planned. He found no math answers there. Instead, he had an overwhelming feeling of a kind of passion for knowledge, for learning of all sorts, and for the children who sat that day at the small desks, as Gabe did. He felt Mentor's love for his students and his hopes for them and what they would learn from him. The veer ended suddenly, as it always did, and Gabe put his head into his hands. The sounds of the classroom returned, and the schoolmaster appeared beside him. "Are you all right, Gabriel?" Gabe found himself shaking. He had tears in his eyes. "I don't feel well," he whispered. Mentor excused him for the rest of the day, and Gabe walked slowly away from the schoolhouse, promising himself that he would study, that he would not disappoint his teacher again as he had so often in the past. He never told anyone. Veering seemed a private act, something to both savor and sometimes dread alone. Now, though, he found himself wishing he had confided in Maddie when he'd had the opportunity. Not only about the veer. He wished he had told Maddie about how desperately he yearned to know about his mother. He couldn't tell his lodge mates. They would laugh. But Maddie would have understood. And it was lonely to yearn so, all alone. He reached down into the path, picked up a small pebble, and tossed it toward Maddie's gravestone. It tapped lightly against the rock and fell to the ground, where other pebbles lay near the flowers. He had thrown each of them. "Hi," Gabe whispered. Ahead from the pavilion where gatherings were held, he heard music and the happy shouts of children. He thought of his friends, of the games they were already playing, and of the contests and dancing later. He thought of pretty Deirdre, with the sprinkling of freckles across her nose. He saw smoke and could smell the pigs that had been roasting on a spit most of the day. He knew Kira would have made a pie, and that there would be thick cream swirled with honey to mound on top of it. Gabe left the cemetery and his somber thoughts behind him, and began to run toward the party. We've got time for one more chapter, I believe. And then, yeah, I think it's only going to take us one more reading after this to finish this book. So any of those book suggestions, you better get them in this week. Her back ached badly. It had ached for a long time now, for several years, but it was getting worse, and Claire had difficulty straightening herself. She walked bent. She had gone to see Herbalist, the man who dispensed medicines to villagers, but it was clear that his remedies were the same that she had learned in her years with Alice. The drinking of birch and willow tea would ease the pain, but it would not take it away. Herbalist had asked her the obvious question. "What is your age?" "I don't know," she replied to him. That was true. She had been a young girl when she was washed from the sea to the place where she had lived for years. She had grown up there and become a young woman. She had left there and become, overnight, old. It was not a question of years. Herbalist was not surprised by her answer. Many people who had found their way to the village had little memory of their own past. He prescribed the bark infusions for her aches, but said to her, "Such pain comes for us all in great age." "I know," Claire said. She had no wish to explain what had befallen her. Herbalist lifted her arm gently and felt the thin, sagging skin. Carefully, he examined the dark spots on the backs of her hands. "Do you still have teeth?" he asked. "Some," she said, and showed him. "And your eyes? Ears?" She could still see and hear. "So," Herbalist said with a smile, "you can't dance or chew meat. But if you can hear the birds sing and watch the wind in the leaves, then you still have much pleasure left." "Your time is limited now, though," he told her, "so you should enjoy everything you can. That's what I do. I think I must be as old as you. I have the same aches." He wrapped the dried barks for her, and she placed them in her carrying basket. "I'll see you at the feast," he said as she turned to go. "We can watch the dancing and remember our younger years. There is pleasure in that." Claire thanked him, leaned on her cane, and continued down the path to her small cottage. In the distance she could hear some young boys shouting as they played some sort of game with a ball. Perhaps one was Gabe. She rarely found him at games lately, though. Most often he was alone in the clearing near the river, hammering away on the misshapen vessel that he called his boat. Claire often stood hidden in the trees and watched him at work. In a way, she admired his dedication to the odd project, but it saddened and puzzled her, his wish to be gone. When she had entered the village for the first time, like so many others, she had been welcomed years before. The fragility of old age was new to her then, and it had still startled her when she rose in the morning with her bones aching and stiff. The memory of running, climbing, even dancing was alive and throbbing within her, but frailty made her hobble and limp. She had seen her son for the first time in this place when he was a child of 8 or 9. She remembered that day. He ran along the path near the cottage to which she had been assigned, calling to his friends, laughing, his unkempt hair bright in the sunlight. "Gabe!" she heard a boy call, but she would have known him without hearing it. It was the same smile she remembered, the same silvery laugh. She had moved forward in that moment, intending to rush to him, to greet and embrace him. Perhaps she could make the silly face, the one with which they had once mimicked each other. But when she started eagerly toward him, she forgot her own weakness. Her dragging foot caught on a stone, and she stumbled clumsily. Quickly she righted herself, but in that moment she saw him glance toward her, then look away in disinterest. As if looking through his eyes, she perceived her own withered skin, her sparse gray hair, the awkward gait with which she moved. She stayed silent and turned away, thinking. Did he need to know, after all? He appeared to be a happy child. If she were to make herself known, to tell her unbelievable story, he would be stunned, uncomprehending. His friends might taunt him. Perhaps he would reject her, or worse, perhaps he would feel obligated to tend her in her remaining days. His carefree life would be interrupted. She would be a burden, an embarrassment. In the end, she decided that it was enough that she had found him. She would let him be. But she realized then the magnitude of the cruel exchange Trademaster had offered her. Through the years, she had watched Gabe grow from a mischievous boy into this quiet young man who now seemed to have a mission she didn't understand. Why a boat? The river was a dangerous thing. The village children could swim and play in the one protected section where the water was shallow and slow, but farther out and farther along, the water rushed furiously over sharp rocks. She had heard that there was a steep waterfall someplace, and fallen trees here and there that could easily smash the thin boards he was so carefully tied together with strips of bamboo. Claire was very frightened of swift-moving water. She had reason to be. She had once lived beside a river, once beside a sea. Both had brought her heartbreak and loss. She did not want her son to be lost to water. The crisp skinned pork, sliced from the roasted pig on the spit, smelled delicious, but she knew it was not for her, not with her remaining teeth loose and her gums sore. Claire filled her plate from a large bowl of soft beans that had been baking all day in a sauce of tomatoes and herbs, and added a piece of soft bread. She would leave room, though, she thought, for a slice of blackberry pie. She set her plate on a table and eased herself onto a bench next to several others. A pregnant woman smiled at her and moved slightly, making room. Claire recognized her as Jean, the wife of one of the fiddlers who was tuning their instruments and preparing to play for the dancing. Kira was there too, keeping an eye on her toddlers as they played near the table. From time to time she spooned food into their mouths, as if they were baby birds. Eating slowly, watching the young women at her table, Claire realized that she might have been one of them. She looked down at her own gnarled hand holding a fork, an old woman's hand. Herbalist had told her she was nearing her last days, and she sensed that it was true. But inside herself, she was a young woman still. If she had not made the trade that had brought her here, youth. In her memory, Claire could still hear how Trademaster had breathed the word into her ear, had spat against her cheek with it, how she had nodded in assent and whispered to him, "Trade." She would perhaps be back with Einar now, helping him tend his lambs, cooking a stew they would share in their hillside hut, talking together by the fire in the evenings. But she would not have found her son. She would never have seen Gabe again, would not have watched him grow into the lively young man he had become. She knew it was a trade she would make again, given the chance. She rose to return her emptied plate, to get herself a piece of pie, and looked over to the table where the boisterous young boys were sitting together. He was there. She saw him glance sideways at her as she passed, then his attention returned to his plate, heaped as it was with food, and to a lengthy joke one of his friends was telling. In adolescence, Gabe was gangly and tall, and as she watched, his elbow knocked over the mug holding his drink. The other boys chortled as he sheepishly mopped up the mess with his napkin. His hair was curly, as hers, now a sparse bun at the back of her head, had once been. His blue eyes were surprisingly pale. Jonas had the same eyes. So did his wife, Kira. Claire remembered now that she had noticed the unusual eyes when Gabe was an infant. Those early days had come back to her very slowly, and with pain attached to each memory. The feel of the mask clamped over her face during his birth. She had shuddered when that memory returned. How, later, she had held him for the first time, and had noticed the startling pale eyes. When she recalled it, she was suffused with a feeling of loss. Then she remembered a dream she had had, of a hidden, light-eyed baby. Oh. There we go. Okay. Then she remembered a dream she had had, of a hidden, light-eyed baby. How in the dream she had kept him concealed in a drawer. Thinking of it, after all this time, she almost wept at the sadness of all it implied. She did weep when the next memory came back, of how he had grinned and wiggled his chubby fingers at her. He had learned by then to say her name. Claire, he had said in his high voice, and bye-bye. She did not regret the trade she had made in order to find him, but she was desperately sad to realize that her time was short now. Instead of the strong and vibrant young woman she should be, the mother Gabe deserved, she was now an ancient hag waiting for death. It was a hideous joke that Trademaster had played on them both 7 years before. The sky darkened as night fell and the music began in earnest. Soon it would be time for the young people, the time for dancing and flirtation. Claire saw Gabe rise from his seat and make his way over to the pretty, freckle-faced girl named Deirdre. He stood self-consciously talking to her as she helped to clean the tables. She could see that Deirdre was self-conscious too, but that she purposely walked in a way that made her striped skirt twirl and flutter. Women gathered their dishes and babies in order to take them home. Claire watched Kira with the children. Annabelle was half asleep in her arms, but Matthew was dashing about wildly. Finally, Jonas scooped him up and laughed as the overtired 2-year-old kicked and cried. Together they gathered their things and called good night, then started down the path from the pavilion toward their home. Jonas had set Matthew on his shoulders, and the couple became silhouettes against the sky as the moon rose and Claire watched. Although Jonas had no awareness of who she had once been, that once she and he had been two contemporaries in the same community, Claire remembered Jonas as a boy. He was too young for fatherhood then, nonetheless. It had been he who had saved a baby sentenced to die because the little one was eager and curious and lively, because he didn't sleep. He was, what was the word? Disruptive. Didn't fit in. Jonas had risked his own life, sacrificed his future to bring him here. She wondered if he worried about Gabe now, about the frailty of the little boat he was striving to build and the dangers he would face if somehow he launched it into the river. When she rose from her seat in order to start down the path to her own cottage, her hip had stiffened, and she stood for a moment massaging it with her hand before she was able to walk. Finally, she started down the gentle hill, carefully feeling her way in the moonlight. How soon she would have gone, Claire thought and sighed. Whoa, how soon she would be gone, Claire thought and sighed. How little Gabe would never know about his own past. Then she stopped suddenly and stood still. Of course, she thought. She knew what she would do. She decided she would tell her story, her own history that she had kept so secret until now, to Jonas. Someday, after she was gone, if the time was ever right, when the boy was old enough and ready, he could pass it on to her son. All right. Yes, kids, I believe we have only one more reading left before we finally finish this book. I'm very excited to see how it all ends. So, thank you so much for everyone who was supposed to be watching me on Monday, but we moved to today. Thank you so much for being patient and flexible with me. For anyone who might be brand spanking new, thanks for hanging out. Thanks for joining us. I hope you make it a regular thing. Every Monday, 8 to 9, 8 to 9:15. Sometimes it just depends. But if you happen to miss any of these readings, it's on my YouTube channel. So feel free to hop over there and check out my other content on YouTube. So until then, I will see you guys next week. Stay hydrated and stay safe. I'll see you next week.